Right now, you're looking at a screen, probably in bed, maybe scrolling through your phone before sleep. You exist in a documented moment. If someone wanted to know what life was like in the 2020s, they could find out pretty easily. Photos, videos, text messages, social media posts. We're probably the most recorded generation in human history. Every mundane detail preserved forever in digital amber. But here's something that should keep you up at night, or maybe help you fall asleep depending on why you're here. For most of human history, we have absolutely no idea what happened. Not just sparse details, not just missing footnotes, complete blank spaces, centuries, sometimes millennia, where civilizations just vanish from the historical record. No writing, no artifacts, sometimes not even ruins, just silence. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and let me know where you are and what time it is. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at dawn, Toronto at midnight, all experiencing the same mysteries across time zones. We call them the Lost Ages, periods of human history that should be full of people, cities, art, technology, all the noise of civilization, but instead we find nothing, or almost nothing, just enough to know something was there, and then it wasn't. Think about that for a second. Entire civilizations, hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions, living their lives, building cities, raising children, creating art, and then suddenly the record just stops. It's like someone took an eraser to whole chapters of the human story. Buildings crumble to dust, languages are forgotten, even the names of gods disappear, and we're left staring at the gaps trying to figure out what the hell happened. The weird thing is, these aren't just small gaps. We're not talking about losing track of some minor tribe that lived in the mountains. We're talking about advanced civilizations with writing systems, trade networks, massive architectural achievements, populations in the millions, just gone. And not gone like they were conquered and absorbed. Gone like they chose to stop being civilized, or something forced them to stop. Tonight, we're going to explore these shadows between the pages of history, the periods that don't make sense, the times when everything we think we know about human progress just breaks down. What happened during the 100,000 years when anatomically modern humans, people with brains identical to yours and mine, lived on Earth but apparently did almost nothing we'd recognize as civilization? They had the same intelligence, the same capacity for language and abstract thought, but somehow didn't build cities or develop agriculture or create written language for tens of thousands of years. Why? What caused the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when virtually every major civilization in the Mediterranean and Near East suddenly imploded within a few decades? Empires that had stood for centuries, trade networks that spanned continents, all crashing down simultaneously, and then 400 years of near silence, the Greek Dark Ages, where a civilization that had writing just forgot how to write. What happened to the Indus Valley civilization, one of the largest and most advanced societies of the ancient world, which just abandoned its massive cities and vanished into the Indian countryside around 1900 BCE? No signs of war, no evidence of disease or famine. They just left, and we still can't read their writing to know why. Could a cosmic impact 12,000 years ago have wiped out advanced civilizations we don't even know existed? The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis suggests that maybe human civilization is older and more fragile than we think. Why did the Maya, masters of astronomy and mathematics, abandon their magnificent cities in the 9th century CE, leaving pyramids to be swallowed by jungle, as if the forest itself was reclaiming a debt? These aren't just academic questions. These are mysteries about what humanity is capable of and what can make it all disappear. Because here's the thing that should really unsettle you. Every one of these lost ages seemed impossible to the people living before them. The Bronze Age civilizations thought they'd last forever. The Maya believed their cities were eternal. Everyone thinks their world is permanent, until suddenly it isn't. So what happened during these unexplained gaps? Why do entire civilizations sometimes just fall into darkness? And maybe the most unsettling question of all, could it happen to us? Let's start at the beginning, or at least where the beginning gets really strange. With 100,000 years of modern humans who somehow forgot to invent civilization, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, that's us. We've been around for about 300,000 years, maybe longer. The fossils don't lie. Skulls from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to 315,000 years ago, show all the defining features: high, rounded cranium, flat face, prominent chin. These weren't archaic humans transitioning toward modernity. These were people who, if you dressed them in modern clothes and put them on a subway, you wouldn't look twice. But here's the thing that should keep you up at night, though hopefully it won't since you're trying to sleep. For at least 200,000 of those 300,000 years, we did almost nothing. Or at least that's what the archaeological record suggests. No cities, no agriculture, no written language, no monumental architecture. Just small bands of hunter-gatherers moving across the landscape, leaving behind scattered stone tools and occasional burial sites. 200,000 years. Let that sink in. That's twice as long as the time separating us from Neanderthals. It's 40 times longer than all of recorded human history. It's so vast a time span that your brain can't really process it. If you lived 1 year for every generation, you'd need to live for 10,000 years just to cover this missing period. And we call ourselves advanced. We congratulate ourselves on going from the Wright brothers to the moon landing in 66 years. From the first computer to smartphones in 70 years. We think we're hot stuff because we can access the sum of human knowledge from devices in our pockets. But our ancestors, who were just as smart as us, genetically identical to us, with the same brain capacity and the same cognitive abilities, they spent 200,000 years doing what exactly? The standard explanation goes like this. Early humans were surviving. That's it. Just surviving. They were busy finding food, avoiding predators, dealing with climate fluctuations. They didn't have time for civilization because every day was a struggle against extinction. They were living hand to mouth, season to season, with no energy left over for innovation or cultural development. And sure, there's truth to that. Life in the Paleolithic was hard. Infant mortality was staggering. Average lifespan was probably 25 to 30 years. Disease, injury, starvation, these were constant threats. Groups probably went extinct regularly, wiped out by local disasters or resource failures. But here's what bothers me about that explanation. It assumes our ancestors were somehow less capable than us, less inventive, less curious, less human. And the evidence just doesn't support that assumption. Every time archaeologists look closely at early human sites, they find hints of sophistication that shouldn't be there. Not according to the standard model anyway. Take ochre, red iron oxide pigment. We've been mining and processing ochre for at least 300,000 years, possibly longer. Why? It has no obvious survival function. You can't eat it. It doesn't make better tools. But our ancestors went to incredible effort to obtain it, sometimes travelling dozens of miles to ochre sources, processing it into powder, mixing it with other materials. The standard explanation is body decoration or ritual use. But that just raises more questions. Why would people struggling to survive spend precious time and energy on decoration? Unless decoration wasn't frivolous. Unless it serves some social or cognitive function we don't fully understand. Maybe it was about group identity. Maybe it was early art, early symbolic thinking, early religion. Maybe it was all of those things. Or consider shell beads. We have shell beads from sites across Africa and the Middle East dating back 100,000 years or more. Again, no survival function. But somebody was drilling holes in shells, stringing them together, wearing them or trading them. This is abstract thinking. This is aesthetic sense. This is culture. And it gets weirder. In South Africa, at a site called Blombus Cave, archaeologists found engraved ochre pieces dating to 75,000 years ago. Geometric patterns deliberately made, clearly symbolic. They also found evidence of sophisticated adhesive technology, compound glues made from plant gums and ochre, heated to precise temperatures to achieve the right consistency. This isn't crude survival. This is chemistry. This is engineering. By the way, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? Are you drifting off to sleep at midnight? Or is this background for a morning commute? Drop a comment and let me know. I love seeing where these videos end up. So we have evidence of symbolic thinking, artistic expression, and complex technology going back at least 75,000 years, probably much further. Yet somehow civilization didn't emerge until about 12,000 years ago. What were we doing for those 63,000 years in between? More importantly, what were we doing for the 200,000 years before that? Some researchers think we're asking the wrong question. Maybe early humans weren't failing to build civilization. Maybe they were choosing not to. Maybe they had social systems that were highly sophisticated but didn't require permanent settlements or monumental architecture. Knowledge systems passed down orally through generations, complex enough to encompass astronomy, medicine, ecology, but leaving no archaeological trace. Think about Aboriginal Australian cultures. When Europeans arrived, they dismissed these societies as primitive because they didn't have agriculture or cities. But Aboriginal Australians had been living in Australia for 65,000 years. They had accumulated vast bodies of knowledge about their environment. They had intricate kinship systems that maintained social order across enormous territories. They had song lines, sacred paths crossing the continent, encoding information about water sources, seasonal changes, and cultural history in oral traditions so robust they lasted tens of thousands of years. What if early humans everywhere had similar systems? Not written down, not built in stone, but sophisticated nonetheless. Oral histories that preserved information across hundreds of generations. Seasonal migration patterns optimized over millennia. Social networks that moved people, genes, and ideas across continents. This stuff doesn't fossilize. It leaves almost no trace. A few stone tools, some ochre, occasional burials. From that sparse record, we assume simplicity. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Then there's the climate question. For most of the past 300,000 years, the climate has been unstable. Ice ages advancing and retreating, rainfall patterns shifting, coastlines rising and falling. Agriculture requires climate stability. You need predictable seasons, reliable rainfall, stable temperatures. For most of human existence, we didn't have that. Maybe our ancestors tried agriculture multiple times. Maybe small groups figured out that you could plant seeds and harvest crops. But then the climate shifted. The rains failed. The temperature dropped. The crops died. And the knowledge died with them, or got relegated to the status of myth. Stories about a time when plants grew without searching, when food was abundant, when people didn't have to move constantly. And here's the really unsettling possibility. Maybe they did build things. Maybe there were early experiments with permanent settlements, with specialized labor, with social hierarchy. But they were built of wood and plant fiber, materials that decay completely in a few hundred years. Or they were located on coastlines that are now underwater, drowned when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. We know sea levels were 120 meters lower during the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago. That's 400 feet. Massive areas of continental shelf were dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Mediterranean was smaller. Indonesia and Malaysia were connected by land bridges. Those coastlines would have been prime real estate, reliable water, marine resources, moderate climate. If early humans built anything sophisticated, they probably built it on those coastlines. And it's all underwater now, buried under sediment, destroyed by 20,000 years of tides and currents. We'll never know what was there. We can only speculate. But let's say there were no lost civilizations, no underwater cities, no forgotten golden ages. Let's say the standard model is basically right. Early humans were small bands of hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally, living relatively simple lives. Even then we have to explain the gap. Why did it take 200,000 years for someone to figure out agriculture? The answer might be population. You need a certain population density before civilization becomes possible, before specialization makes sense. If there are only a few thousand humans scattered across Africa, everyone has to be a generalist. Everyone has to know how to find food, make tools, build shelter. There's no room for specialists for people who just make pottery or just manage irrigation systems. But once population reaches a threshold, once groups get large enough and stable enough, specialization becomes advantageous. Someone focuses on tool making and gets really good at it. Someone else focuses on tracking animals. Someone else manages food storage. Everyone benefits. Productivity increases. Technology advances faster. Knowledge accumulates more efficiently. Maybe that threshold wasn't reached until the end of the last ice age, when climate stabilized and populations could finally grow beyond the small scattered bands that had characterized human existence for hundreds of thousands of years. Or maybe it happened multiple times before that, but couldn't be sustained. Populations would grow, specialization would begin, proto-civilizations would emerge, then climate, disaster would strike, populations would crash, the specialists would die, the knowledge would be lost, and humanity would reset to small bands of generalist survivors. If that happened even once, we'd probably never know. The archaeological signature would be almost invisible. A brief increase in site density, a short period of tool sophistication, then nothing. It would look like noise in the data, like random fluctuation. Unless we knew exactly where to look and what to look for, we'd miss it completely. The truth is, we don't know what happened during those missing 100,000 years. We have fragments, hints, tantalizing possibilities. But the full story is lost, eroded by time, buried by sediment, drowned by rising seas, or simply never preserved in the first place. What we do know is that when civilization did finally emerge, it emerged fast. Within just a few thousand years, we went from scattered hunter-gatherers to cities, writing, mathematics, astronomy. Like a spring that had been compressed for 200,000 years, finally releasing all its stored energy at once. Maybe that's what those missing millennia were, the slow build-up of pressure, the gradual accumulation of knowledge and population and cultural complexity. And when conditions finally aligned, when climate stabilized and population reached critical mass, everything humanity had learned during those long-forgotten ages erupted into the historical record. But we'll never know for sure, and that's the point. The shadows of history aren't just in recent centuries, they extend back to our very beginning. We are mysteries even to ourselves. Picture the world in 1200 BCE, not the primitive past you might imagine, but a sophisticated international system that would look surprisingly familiar to us today. A network of civilizations spanning from Greece to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to Anatolia, all connected by trade routes, diplomatic correspondence, and cultural exchange. This was the late Bronze Age, and it was magnificent. The Egyptians were at the height of their New Kingdom power, building massive temples and trading with partners across the Mediterranean. The Hittites controlled Anatolia with an empire that rivaled Egypt in wealth and military might. The Mycenaeans dominated Greece with their palatial centres and warrior culture. The Assyrians were rising in Mesopotamia. The Cypriots were manufacturing copper on an industrial scale. The Canaanites were running merchant operations that connected Africa, Europe, and Asia. These weren't isolated kingdoms. They were part of an integrated system. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters with Hittite kings, addressing each other as brothers. Mycenaean pottery shows up in Egyptian tombs. Cypriot copper is found in workshops from Greece to Iraq. Mesopotamian cylinder seals appear in Greek palaces. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt, reveal a world of international relations that would make modern diplomats nod in recognition. Treaties, trade agreements, marriage alliances between royal families, complaints about unpaid debts, requests for medical specialists. One letter has a Babylonian king asking an Egyptian pharaoh to send gold, lots of gold, because in my brother's land gold is as common as dust. The pharaoh's response, if there was one, hasn't survived, but the exchange shows these civilizations were in constant communication. The cities were incredible. Mycenae had walls so massive that later Greeks thought they must have been built by giants. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, covered 400 acres and housed tens of thousands of people. Ugarit on the Syrian coast was a cosmopolitan port where you could hear half a dozen languages in the marketplace. These weren't primitive villages. They had sophisticated architecture, complex administrative systems, specialized craftsmen, professional armies, literate bureaucracies keeping detailed records on clay tablets and papyrus scrolls. They had running water systems, fortifications that took decades to build, temples decorated with precious metals and imported luxuries. The technology was advanced. Bronze workers had perfected the art of alloying copper and tin to create weapons and tools stronger than anything available before. Shipwrights built vessels capable of carrying tons of cargo across open seas. Scribes had developed multiple writing systems for different languages. Architects understood principles of load-bearing and structural engineering. Doctors performed surgeries. Astronomers tracked celestial movements. This was a civilized world, a connected world, a world that seemed permanent and unshakable. And then, in less than a century, it all collapsed. Not declined, not gradually faded, collapsed, catastrophically and almost simultaneously across the entire eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Around 1200 BCE, the system began to fracture. The signs appeared suddenly and spread fast. Cities started burning, not one or two, but dozens, scattered across thousands of miles. Palaces were destroyed and never rebuilt. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries simply stopped operating. The archaeological evidence is stark and disturbing. At site after site across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant, excavators find the same pattern. A layer of destruction debris, thick ash from massive fires, collapsed walls, burned timber, and then nothing. No rebuilding, no reoccupation, just abandonment. Mycenae, the legendary home of Agamemnon, destroyed. Tiryns with its cyclopean walls burned. Pylos, whose linear B tablets give us a snapshot of Bronze Age administration, went up in flames so suddenly that clay tablets in the archive were still in the process of being written when fire baked them into permanent records. The last tablets from Pylos are desperate inventories of military equipment and Coast Guard deployments, a civilization frantically trying to defend itself against something, but against what? That's where the mystery deepens. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age, simply ceased to exist. Their capital Hattusa was burned so thoroughly that the destruction layer is over 3 feet thick in places. The empire that had corresponded as equals with Egypt, that had fought the Battle of Kadesh to a standstill, that had controlled Anatolia for centuries, vanished from history. In Syria and the Levant, the destruction was even more complete. Ugarit, that cosmopolitan port city, was destroyed so thoroughly it was never rebuilt. Centuries later, its location was forgotten entirely. Modern archaeologists only rediscovered it in the 1920s. The last texts from Ugarit are frantic letters describing enemies approaching by sea, begging for military aid that never came. One letter, never sent, was found in an envelope still sitting in the kiln where it was being fired when the city burned. Egypt survived, but barely. Rameses III left records of fighting off massive invasions by sea and land. His temple reliefs show naval battles against enemies he called the Sea Peoples, coalition forces arriving in ships, bringing their families and possessions with them. Not raiders, migrants, entire populations on the move. But even mighty Egypt was weakened. After Rameses III, Egyptian power began a long decline. They lost control of their northern territories, trade networks collapsed. The bronze economy they'd relied on for centuries began to fail. Within 50 years, the interconnected world of 1200 BCE was gone, replaced by something much darker and much more mysterious. Population levels crashed. Archaeological surveys show a reduction of up to 90% in some regions. That's not a decline. That's near extinction. Cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned. The survivors scattered into small villages or became nomadic. Writing largely disappeared. The Linear B script of the Mycenaeans was completely forgotten. The Hittite cuneiform vanished. Only in Egypt and Mesopotamia did literacy continue, and even there the records become sparse and fragmentary. For the next 3 to 4 centuries, what we call the Greek Dark Ages, the Eastern Mediterranean was a shadow of what it had been. No monumental architecture, no international trade, no written records in most regions. It's as if civilization simply stopped. So what happened? That question has obsessed archaeologists for generations, and there's no simple answer. The traditional explanation was the Sea Peoples, those mysterious invaders that Egyptian texts describe but never clearly identify. The theory was straightforward. Warrior migrants swept through the Eastern Mediterranean like a Bronze Age Viking horde, destroying civilizations as they went. But it doesn't add up. The destruction is too widespread, too simultaneous. Raiders don't destroy everything everywhere at once. They take what's valuable and move on. They don't cause system collapse across 3 continents. More importantly, who were these Sea Peoples? Egyptian texts list names: the Shurdan, the Lucca, the Peliset. But we can't definitively identify most of them. Some scholars think they were displaced populations from the Aegean or Anatolia. Others argue they were symptoms of the collapse, not the cause. Refugees from destroyed civilizations becoming raiders out of desperation. Climate change offers another explanation. Paleoclimate data shows the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe drought beginning around 1200 BCE. Tree ring data, pollen analysis, and sediment cores all point to a prolonged dry period lasting decades. Harvests would have failed, famines would have followed, starving populations would have migrated, fought over remaining resources, destabilized the political system. There's compelling evidence for this. Lake sediments show lower water levels. Pollen records indicate vegetation die-off. Some destroyed sites show signs of drought stress in the decades before their destruction. But drought alone doesn't explain the violence. Civilizations had survived droughts before. Why was this one different? Earthquakes provide yet another piece of the puzzle. The Eastern Mediterranean is seismically active, and geological evidence shows a cluster of major earthquakes around 1200 BCE. Destroyed buildings at many sites show signs of earthquake damage. walls collapsed inward, columns fallen in specific patterns. Some archaeologists argue a series of major quakes, what they call an earthquake storm, struck the region over several decades. This would explain the widespread simultaneous destruction better than human invaders. But earthquakes don't explain the abandonment. Cities damaged by earthquakes get rebuilt. These cities didn't. The most compelling theory is systems collapse. The idea that the interconnected nature of late Bronze Age civilization became its fatal vulnerability. The system was complex. Specialists producing specific goods, trade networks moving resources across vast distances, political structures dependent on continued prosperity and stability. When multiple stresses hit simultaneously, drought reducing agricultural output, earthquakes damaging infrastructure, population movements disrupting trade, the system couldn't adapt. Think of it like a house of cards, each civilization supporting and depending on others. When some began to fall, they brought down their neighbours. Cyprus depended on trade for food. When shipping collapsed, they couldn't survive. Mycenaean palaces depended on tribute from rural areas. When drought hit agriculture, the tribute stopped flowing and the palatial system collapsed. Hittite cities depended on networks of client states. When those states fell, the empire couldn't maintain itself. One by one, the cards fell, and the entire structure came down. The evidence for this is in what survived and what didn't. The palace economies collapsed completely, those centralized systems dependent on literate bureaucracy and long-distance trade. But rural villages often survived. Small communities that produced most of what they needed locally could ride out the storm. The literate, specialized, interconnected civilization disappeared. The illiterate, generalized, localized communities endured. But here's what haunts archaeologists: the sheer speed of it. Bronze Age civilization had existed for over 1,000 years. It had survived crises before, wars, famines, dynastic struggles, but in less than a century it was simply gone. The palaces burned and empty, the trade networks abandoned, the writing systems forgotten, an entire world order erased so thoroughly that later Greeks looking at Mycenaean ruins thought giants must have built them. We're left with fragments, a few Egyptian inscriptions, the desperate last letters from doomed cities, layers of ash and destruction debris. The question isn't just what happened, but how could such a complete collapse occur? How does the accumulated knowledge of centuries simply vanish? How do writing systems get forgotten? How does a network of civilizations that had lasted longer than the United States has existed just disappear? The answer might be more disturbing than any single catastrophe. Because what the Bronze Age collapse shows us is that civilization is fragile, that complexity creates vulnerability, that systems we think are permanent can vanish in a generation. The Bronze Age world thought it was permanent too. They built massive walls and elaborate palaces. They kept detailed records and made long-term plans. And then it was gone. What came after was smaller, poorer, less connected. But somehow the survivors persisted. In the ashes of the Bronze Age, the seeds of something new were beginning to grow. Around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened in Greece. Within a single generation, maybe less, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient Mediterranean simply ceased to exist. Massive stone palaces burned. Trade networks that had connected the Aegean to Egypt and Mesopotamia collapsed. And most mysteriously of all, an entire system of writing, painstakingly developed over centuries, was completely forgotten. The Mycenaean Greeks weren't primitive people living in mud huts. These were the civilization that built Mycenae, Pylos and Tiryns. Massive fortifications with walls so enormous that later Greeks believed they had been constructed by giants. They had a complex bureaucratic system that tracked everything, olive oil production, chariot wheels, quantities of wool, religious offerings. We know this because they kept meticulous records written in what we now call Linear B script, an early form of Greek inscribed on clay tablets. Their palaces were engineering marvels, multi-story complexes with sophisticated drainage systems, plastered walls covered in vibrant frescoes depicting religious ceremonies, bull leaping, and warfare. They had specialized craftsmen producing pottery, metalwork, and textiles that were traded across the known world. Mycenaean artifacts have been found in Italy, the Levant, even as far as Britain. They were warriors too, the civilization that would later inspire Homer's epics of the Trojan War. Archaeological evidence shows they maintained professional military forces, charioteers, infantry equipped with bronze armor and weapons. Their influence extended across the Aegean, with outposts and colonies on dozens of islands and along the coast of Asia Minor. Then, around 1200 BCE, it all ended. Not gradually, not through some long, slow decline. Almost overnight in historical terms, the palatial system collapsed completely. Nearly every major Mycenaean site shows evidence of destruction during this period. Massive fires swept through Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, destroying the administrative centres that had coordinated their civilization. Some sites show signs of violent attack. Others just seem to have been abandoned and then burned, possibly deliberately by their own inhabitants. But here's what makes this collapse so mysterious. The destruction wasn't followed by foreign occupation or replacement by a new civilization. Greece didn't get conquered by some more powerful empire. Instead, the land emptied out. Population estimates suggest Greece lost between 75 and 90% of its inhabitants within a century of the palace destructions. Entire regions that had supported dense agricultural populations became virtually deserted. The survivors didn't rebuild the palaces. They didn't try to restart the administrative systems or revive the trade networks. Instead, they scattered into small villages, sometimes just clusters of a few families living in simple stone or mud brick dwellings. The sophisticated material culture of the Mycenaean period disappeared. Pottery became simple, utilitarian, decorated with basic geometric patterns, instead of the elaborate scenes favoured by Mycenaean craftsmen. Most dramatically, writing vanished completely. Those clay tablets inscribed with Linear B script, they stopped being produced. Within a generation or two, nobody in Greece could read or write. This wasn't just a matter of losing some administrative convenience. This was the complete erasure of a technology that had been essential to Mycenaean civilization. For nearly 400 years, from roughly 1200 to 800 BCE, Greece had no writing system at all, none. The most advanced form of information storage humanity had invented up to that point was simply forgotten. Think about what that means. Imagine every computer, every phone, every written document on Earth suddenly becoming useless. And not just useless, but incomprehensible. Within 2 generations, nobody would remember how to use them, what they were for, or why they had seemed so important. That's what happened to the Greeks. They lived among the ruins of palaces where their ancestors had kept detailed written records, and they had no idea what those scratches on clay tablets meant. They probably didn't even recognize them as writing. This creates a problem for historians trying to understand this period. For the Mycenaean era, we have written records, Linear B tablets that tell us about their economy, their social structure, their religious practices. For the classical Greek period starting around 800 BCE, we have not just records but extensive literature, philosophy, historical accounts. But for those 400 years in between, we have almost nothing. No written sources at all, just archaeology, and even the archaeological record from this period is sparse and difficult to interpret. What we do know paints a picture of scattered, isolated communities living at a much lower level of material complexity than their ancestors. The average Dark Age settlement had maybe 50 to 100 inhabitants. Simple farmers growing wheat and barley, herding sheep and goats, living in single-room houses with no decoration or specialized architecture. They still worked bronze, but the quality declined. They lost many of the specialized metalworking techniques the Mycenaeans had developed. Iron begins appearing during this period, but not as some revolutionary new technology. Early Dark Age iron tools were often worse than the bronze implements they replaced. People used iron because tin, necessary for making bronze, was no longer available through trade networks that had ceased to exist. Population density collapsed so dramatically that whole landscapes changed. Without intensive agriculture, forests reclaimed land that had been cultivated for centuries. Wild animals that had been hunted nearly to extinction during the Mycenaean period returned. In some ways, Greece became more ecologically diverse during the Dark Ages than it had been before the collapse. But this came at the cost of human suffering we can barely imagine. Those population losses, 75 to 90% over a century, they weren't gentle. They represent mass death, starvation, disease, violence, and displacement on a scale that dwarfs most historical catastrophes. Yet something survived. Knowledge survived. Culture survived. Not in written form, not in permanent archives or libraries, but in human memory, passed down through oral tradition. The Greeks of the Dark Ages couldn't write, but they could remember. And they did remember in the form of epic poetry. Professional singers, what the Greeks later called oidoi, memorized vast poetic compositions about the deeds of ancestors, stories of heroes and kings, battles and tragedies, the glory of a lost age when Greeks had lived in stone palaces and sailed across the seas in great fleets. These weren't just entertainment, though they certainly served that purpose. They were living archives. Oral epics preserved genealogies connecting Dark Age communities to Mycenaean ancestors, giving them legitimate claims to territory and status. They preserved technical knowledge about things Dark Age Greeks no longer possessed but could still describe in detail. Mycenaean armour, palace architecture, diplomatic protocols between kingdoms. The poems maintained cultural continuity across the void of lost literacy, creating a thread connecting the diminished present to a more glorious past. By 800 BCE, after nearly 400 years, Greek civilization began emerging from the darkness. Population started increasing again. New settlements appeared, growing larger and more complex than Dark Age villages. Trade networks reformed, connecting Greece to the wider Mediterranean world. And most importantly, the Greeks relearned writing. Not Linear B, that was gone forever, forgotten so completely that it wouldn't be deciphered again until 1952. Instead, they adapted the Phoenician alphabet, creating the Greek writing system that would become the foundation for most European scripts. When literacy returned, one of the first things the Greeks did was write down those oral epics that had been preserved through 4 centuries of darkness. Homer, whether one person or many, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey in written form somewhere around 750 BCE. These weren't contemporary accounts. They were stories about events that had happened 400 to 500 years earlier, passed down through countless generations of oral poets. Yet they contained genuine historical information, references to places, objects and customs from the Mycenaean period that the Greeks of Homer's time couldn't have known about except through this continuous oral tradition. Archaeologists have verified this in ways that would have seemed impossible a century ago. When Heinrich Schliemann excavated Mycenae in the 1870s following clues from Homer's text, scholars dismissed it as lucky guesswork. But the deeper we dig, the more we realize Homer got right. The boar's tusk helmet described in the Iliad, an object that hadn't been made in Greece for over 800 years when Homer lived, we found them in Mycenaean tombs, exactly as described. The massive walls of Troy, the layout of Mycenaean palaces, even some names and genealogies they check out. Somehow, through 400 years of darkness, collapse, and cultural destruction, the memory held. But what the oral traditions couldn't preserve was the mundane, the daily details of how Dark Age Greeks actually lived. For that, we need archaeology, and the picture it reveals is both humbling and inspiring. These people had lost so much. Technologies their grandparents had taken for granted were now beyond their capability to reproduce. They lived in a landscape dotted with ruins they couldn't fully understand, monuments to a civilization they could barely imagine but knew they had descended from. Yet they survived. In scattered villages across Greece, farmers continued planting and harvesting. Potters continued making vessels simpler than before but functional. Metalworkers continued forging tools and weapons, passing their knowledge to apprentices who would pass it on in turn. And singers continued reciting the old poems, keeping alive the memory of heroes and gods, preserving the cultural identity that would eventually allow Greek civilization to coalesce again. The Dark Ages didn't last forever. By 800 BCE, Greece was emerging into what historians call the Archaic period. Populations were growing again. Trade was reviving. New forms of political organization were emerging, the city-states that would define classical Greece. Within a few centuries, Greeks would be producing philosophy, drama, history, mathematics, and architecture that would influence human civilization for millennia. But they would do all of this as people who knew what it meant to lose everything. Every Greek city-state preserved stories of the Dark Ages, cautionary tales about the fragility of civilization and the importance of maintaining knowledge and community. We still don't fully understand what caused the Bronze Age collapse that triggered the Greek Dark Ages. Climate change probably played a role. Evidence suggests a prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Invasions by mysterious sea peoples may have disrupted trade networks. Internal social tensions within Mycenaean kingdoms might have contributed to their vulnerability. Most likely it was all of these factors combining into a perfect storm of catastrophe that the palace-centered Mycenaean system simply couldn't survive. But what followed, those 400 years of darkness, they demonstrate something profound about human resilience. Civilization can collapse, technologies can be lost, population can crash. Yet as long as some people survive, as long as they maintain their stories and their knowledge, recovery is possible. The thread might become thin, almost invisible, but it doesn't have to break completely. Those Dark Age villagers, living in the shadows of ruins they couldn't rebuild, singing songs about heroes they could barely imagine, they kept the thread intact. And when conditions improved, when the rains returned and trade routes reopened, that thread became the foundation for a new flowering of Greek culture that would change the world. The Greek Dark Ages weren't the end of Greek civilization. They were a chrysalis, a period of transformation when the old Mycenaean system died and something new, something more resilient, was born from its remains. Picture a civilization that by all accounts should never have been forgotten. Around 2600 BCE, while Egypt was building pyramids and Mesopotamia was writing epic poetry, a third great civilization was flourishing across the Indus River Valley. But you probably learned almost nothing about it in school, not because it wasn't important, but because it left behind the most confounding mystery in archaeological history. A civilization that had everything: advanced urban planning, sophisticated engineering, standardized weights and measures, continental trade networks, and then Over the course of a few centuries, they just walked away from it all. This is the story of the Harappan civilization. And it's not like other collapse narratives. This isn't about invasion or catastrophe or sudden destruction. This is about something far stranger. A society that might have deliberately chosen to abandon everything it had built. Let's start with what they achieved, because it's staggering. At its peak, around 2000 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization sprawled across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Over 1,500 settlements spread across what's now Pakistan, northwestern India, and parts of Afghanistan. 5 million people, maybe more. Cities with populations in the tens of thousands. And here's what makes it really remarkable. They didn't just stumble into civilization. They engineered it with a precision that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Take Mohenjo-Daro, one of their largest cities. The entire settlement was built on a grid system with streets running perfectly north-south and east-west. Not approximately, perfectly. Using measurements that were standardized across the entire civilization. Every brick in every building was made to the exact same proportions, 4:1 ratio, whether you were in Mohenjo-Daro or in a city 500 miles away. They had covered sewage systems running under every street. Individual houses had private bathrooms with drainage that connected to municipal sewers. Some homes had multi-story construction with sophisticated ventilation systems. This wasn't primitive urbanism. This was city planning that rivaled anything Europe would achieve until the 19th century. They built massive granaries for food storage, probably managed through some kind of centralized distribution system. They had public baths, including the famous Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a waterproof pool 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, made with precisely fitted bricks and waterproofed with natural tar. The engineering required to keep that pool from leaking was extraordinarily sophisticated. Their trade network stretched from the Persian Gulf to Central Asia. Harappan seals, small carved stones used to mark goods and documents, have been found in Mesopotamian cities, evidence of regular commercial contact across thousands of miles. They were exporting cotton textiles, possibly the first civilization to weave cotton on an industrial scale. They worked copper, bronze, lead, and tin. They crafted jewellery with techniques so advanced that modern jewellers struggle to replicate them. And they did all of this without any evidence of a ruling class, no palaces, no temples that we can identify, no royal tombs filled with treasures, no monuments to glorify kings. The houses in Harappan cities show remarkably little variation in size or quality. Some are bigger than others, sure, but there's nothing like the massive inequality you see in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Everyone seems to have had access to the same standardized goods, the same sewage systems, the same quality of life. It's like they built an egalitarian technocracy 4,000 years before anyone else even conceived of the idea. But here's where it gets frustrating. They left behind thousands of inscriptions on those seals and pottery and tablets, short texts, usually just a few symbols, sometimes accompanied by images of animals or geometric patterns, and we cannot read a single word, not one. The Indus script remains completely undeciphered despite decades of effort by linguists, cryptographers, and computer algorithms. We have about 400 distinct symbols. We know the script was written right to left based on how the inscriptions are laid out. We can see that certain symbols appear more frequently, suggesting they represent common words or sounds. But we don't know what language they were writing. We don't know if it's related to any modern language family. We can't even agree on whether it's a full writing system or some kind of proto-writing. This means everything we know about the Harappan civilization comes from archaeology alone. Their buildings, their artifacts, their city layouts. We can see what they did, but we can't hear their voices. We don't know their stories. their beliefs, their explanations for why they organised society the way they did. It's like watching a silent film where half the scenes are missing. And then, around 1900 BCE, something started changing. Not suddenly, not catastrophically. But gradually, almost methodically, the great cities of the Indus Valley began to empty out. The decline took centuries, which makes it even harder to understand. This wasn't a crisis. This was a choice that played out over generations. The first signs were subtle. Maintenance standards started slipping. In Mohenjo-Daro, you can see it in the archaeological layers. Older construction is precise, carefully planned, built to last. Later buildings are more haphazard, reusing old bricks, ignoring the grid system. Sewage systems stopped being maintained. Streets that had been kept clear for centuries started accumulating debris. The standardized brick sizes became less uniform, suggesting the centralized production systems were breaking down. Population started declining in the major urban centers. Not all at once. People didn't flee. They just left. Families moving away, buildings being abandoned but not destroyed, empty houses slowly crumbling while the city around them kept functioning at reduced capacity. By 1300 BCE, all the major Harappan cities were empty. 5 million people had dispersed across the landscape, abandoning the most sophisticated urban infrastructure in the ancient world. So what happened? The traditional, theory focused on invasion. Ancient texts mentioned Aryan peoples moving into India around this time, and for decades scholars assumed they must have conquered the Harappan civilization. But the archaeology doesn't support it. There's no evidence of warfare, no burned cities, no mass graves, no sudden appearance of a new culture. The Aryan migration probably happened, but it came after the cities were already empty. The second theory blamed climate change, and here the evidence is stronger. Around 2000 BCE, the monsoon patterns that had sustained Harappan agriculture started shifting. Rainfall became less reliable. Some regions that had been fertile started drying out. Core samples from ancient lakes show declining water levels throughout this period. The climate was definitely changing. But here's the thing. The Harappans had survived climate fluctuations before. They'd adapted to droughts and floods for centuries. Why would this change be different? Then there's the river theory. Recent satellite archaeology and geological studies suggest something dramatic happened to the rivers themselves. The Gagahakra river system, which had sustained many Harappan settlements, started drying up. Not because of drought, but because of tectonic activity. The rivers were literally changing course, shifting away from areas that had depended on them for millennia. Cities that had been built on major waterways suddenly found themselves stranded. Wells that had been reliable for generations started running dry. This would explain the pattern of abandonment. The cities didn't fall suddenly because there was no sudden catastrophe. Instead, over generations, people realized their urban centers were becoming unsustainable. The rivers were moving, the climate was shifting, the agricultural surplus that had supported urban life was declining, and so they made a choice. They left. But here's what makes this different from other civilizational collapses. They didn't collapse into chaos. The archaeological evidence suggests something almost unprecedented, a managed decline, a civilization-wide decision to transition away from urban life back to smaller-scale agricultural communities. You can see it in how the cities were abandoned. Buildings weren't burned or torn down, they were just left, suggesting orderly departure rather than panic. Valuable metal goods and tools are found where they were stored, not scattered like they would be if people were fleeing. The drainage systems remained intact until they simply weren't needed anymore. In the post-urban period, we see scattered villages throughout the former Harappan territories. These settlements show clear cultural continuity. They're using similar pottery styles, similar agricultural techniques, similar craft traditions, but they've abandoned the grid cities, the standardized measurements, the centralized grain storage. They've chosen decentralization. It's like they looked at the situation, assessed the resources, and collectively decided that urban civilization wasn't worth maintaining under the new conditions, that smaller, more flexible communities would be more resilient. And maybe they were right. Those villages survived, they adapted, they became the ancestors of later Indian civilizations. The Harappan culture didn't die, it transformed. But we can't know for sure because we can't read their writings. Somewhere in those undeciphered seals might be the explanation. Records of debates about water management, decisions about population dispersal, religious or philosophical reasoning for abandoning the cities, or maybe just shopping lists and tax records. We simply don't know. What we do know is this. The Harappan civilization demonstrated that urban life is a choice, not an inevitability. They built cities as sophisticated as any in the ancient world, and when those cities no longer served their needs, they walked away. No apocalypse required, no dramatic collapse, just a slow, deliberate transition from one way of life to another. Sometimes the most mysterious thing isn't destruction. It's the quiet choice to let go of something that once seemed permanent, to recognize when systems that served you well no longer work, to have the collective wisdom to change course before catastrophe forces your hand. The Harappans might have disappeared from history, but maybe they didn't fail. Maybe they succeeded in ways we're only beginning to understand. Picture this. It's 12,800 years ago. Your ancestors have finally made it. After millions of years of evolution, hundreds of thousands of years of surviving as scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, they're starting to figure things out. The last ice age is ending. The world is warming. Animals are abundant. Plant foods are everywhere. Some groups have even started experimenting with cultivating wild grains, building permanent structures, creating art and monuments. Then, in a single day, everything changes. The sky lights up brighter than the sun. A massive fireball streaks across the horizon, fragmenting as it comes. Maybe you see one impact, maybe you see a dozen. The shockwave levels forests for hundreds of miles. Wildfires ignite across entire continents. Within hours, so much debris has been thrown into the atmosphere that the sky goes dark. Within days, the temperature begins to plummet. Within months, the world has plunged back into an ice age that will last for more than 1,000 years. This isn't science fiction. This is the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. And if it's true, it means we lost an entire chapter of human history in a single catastrophic event. Let's start with what we know for certain. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate was following a predictable pattern. The planet had been steadily warming for thousands of years as the last ice age gradually released its grip. Ice sheets were retreating, sea levels were rising, forests were spreading into areas that had been tundra for millennia. Your ancestors were thriving in this warming world, expanding their populations, developing new technologies, building increasingly complex societies. Then, without warning, the warming stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. Within a decade, maybe less, global temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. The ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. The forests died back. The megafauna that had survived the previous 100,000 years of ice age, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, they suddenly went extinct. Not just in one place, everywhere, across North America, South America, Europe, Asia. 35 genera of large mammals disappeared within a geological instant. Geologists call this climate reversal the Younger Dryas, named after a tiny Arctic flower that suddenly reappeared in European pollen records during this cold snap. For decades, the mainstream explanation was that it was caused by changes in ocean circulation, possibly triggered by massive freshwater floods from melting ice sheets disrupting the Gulf Stream. But that explanation never quite fit all the evidence. Ocean circulation changes don't happen overnight. They don't cause continent-wide wildfires. They don't explain the sudden extinction of animals that had survived multiple previous climate swings. They don't account for the weird geological signatures that started showing up at the boundary layer marking the beginning of the Younger Dryas. In 2007, a group of researchers proposed something radical. What if the Younger Dryas wasn't caused by gradual climate processes at all? What if it was triggered by an impact event? Not a single asteroid or comet, but a fragmented one, breaking up as it entered Earth's atmosphere and depositing its energy across vast areas of the Northern Hemisphere. The evidence they pointed to was compelling. At sites across North America, Europe and Asia, at the exact geological layer marking the start of the Younger Dryas, researchers found concentrations of materials that shouldn't be there. Microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds that only form under extreme pressure and temperature. Magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock that indicate exposure to temperatures above 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon spherules suggesting massive wildfires. Platinum and iridium concentrations far higher than normal, typical of extraterrestrial impacts. Most intriguingly, a form of carbon called glass-like carbon that forms when organic material is subjected to extreme heat and pressure, exactly what you'd expect from an airburst explosion. The hypothesis was controversial from the start. Many archaeologists and geologists pushed back hard. Some couldn't replicate the findings. Others argued the evidence could be explained by other processes, wildfires, volcanic activity, normal cosmic dust accumulation. The debate became heated, sometimes personal, but here's what nobody disputes. Something dramatic happened 12,800 years ago. Something that triggered rapid climate change, massive extinctions, and widespread environmental catastrophe. The only question is what? And here's where the story gets really interesting. Because around the same time this catastrophe was happening, something else was going on. Something that suggests human civilization might be much older than we think. In southeastern Turkey, there's a place called Göbekli Tepe. When it was discovered in the 1990s, it rewrote everything we thought we knew about early human societies. The site consists of massive stone circles, some over 20 feet in diameter, made from limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each. The pillars are carved with intricate reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and strange geometric patterns. The construction would have required coordinated labour by hundreds of people, sophisticated stoneworking techniques, and complex social organisation. The radiocarbon dates came back between 11,500 and 9,500 years old, which means Göbekli Tepe was built right after the Younger Dryas ended. But here's the thing, you don't just wake up one morning and decide to build something like Göbekli Tepe. The people who built it had generations, maybe millennia, of architectural experience. They knew quarrying, stone transport, carving, engineering. They had developed religious or astronomical concepts sophisticated enough to justify such massive construction projects. They had social hierarchies capable of organising and feeding large labour forces, all of which suggests there was something before Göbekli Tepe, something earlier, something that gave them all that knowledge and experience. But where is it? Why don't we find monuments from 13,000 or 14,000 years ago? Unless we do, and we just haven't recognised them yet. Or unless they existed in places we can't access anymore. Because here's something most people don't realise. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. That means vast areas that are now underwater, continental shelves extending for miles beyond current coastlines, were dry land 12,800 years ago? And where do humans naturally settle? Near water, on coastlines, river deltas, places with reliable access to food and trade routes. If there were complex societies 15,000 or 20,000 years ago, they would have been concentrated in exactly the areas that are now under hundreds of feet of seawater. Everything they built, every monument, every settlement, every technological achievement, all of it would be on the ocean floor now, buried under sediment, eroded by currents, invisible to conventional archaeology. The impact hypothesis suddenly makes this scenario plausible. If a comet or asteroid fragment exploded over the ice sheets covering North America, the energy released would have been equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The ice sheets would have melted catastrophically. Within days or weeks, massive floods would have inundated coastal areas worldwide. Any societies living near the coasts would have been wiped out, their monuments destroyed, their knowledge lost, their very existence erased from the archaeological record. The survivors would have been inland groups, probably less technologically advanced, probably smaller in population. They would have preserved some knowledge, some techniques, some memories, but much would have been lost. It would take generations, maybe millennia, for human societies to recover and rebuild. By the time they did, the old world would be legend. Stories told around campfires about cities beneath the waves, advanced ancestors, a golden age before the flood. Sound familiar? Because flood myths show up in virtually every ancient culture on Earth. The biblical flood, the Sumerian flood epic, the Greek story of Deucalion, the Hindu myth of Manu, the Chinese tale of Gun Yu, indigenous Australian dreamtime stories of rising seas. They all describe a catastrophic flood that destroyed an earlier world and forced humanity to start over. Traditional archaeology dismisses these as myths, symbolic stories about local flooding events. But what if they're memories, distorted by thousands of years of oral transmission, but fundamentally based on real events? The geological evidence supports massive flooding at the end of the Younger Dryas. When the climate suddenly warmed again 11,600 years ago, probably as abruptly as it had cooled, the accumulated ice from 1,200 years of renewed glaciation melted rapidly. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet in just a few thousand years. That might sound gradual, but in human terms it meant coastlines retreating by miles within a single generation. Any settlements near the old coastlines would have been abandoned, then submerged, their locations forgotten within a few centuries as populations adapted to the new geography. Now, mainstream archaeology remains deeply skeptical of all this, and for good reasons. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The impact hypothesis, while intriguing, still faces serious challenges. Not all researchers can find the signature materials at the Younger Dryas boundary. The proposed impact mechanism, a fragmented comet causing airbursts rather than craters, is hard to prove definitively because it wouldn't leave the kind of obvious evidence that a single large impact would, and the idea of advanced pre-Younger Dryas civilizations remains highly speculative. We have tantalizing hints like Göbekli Tepe, but no smoking gun. No underwater cities, no clearly pre-Younger Dryas monuments, no artifacts that definitively prove complex civilization existed before the catastrophe. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when we've only explored a tiny fraction of the submerged continental shelves. Most underwater archaeology focuses on known historical shipwrecks and harbours. Very little systematic survey work has been done on the now submerged landscapes where pre-flood societies would have lived. We're looking for needles in a haystack while only searching a corner of the barn. What we do know is this: the Younger Dryas was real. It was catastrophic. It coincided with mass extinctions and major disruptions in human societies worldwide. the warming period just before it saw rapid human population growth and increasing social complexity. The period just after it saw the sudden appearance of monumental architecture, agriculture, and the first cities. There's a missing chapter in that story, a gap where something happened that we don't fully understand yet. Maybe it was just climate change. Maybe it was an impact. Maybe it was both. Maybe human societies 13,000 years ago were more advanced than we give them credit for, and the Younger Dryas set them back by millennia. Or maybe we're asking the wrong questions entirely. Maybe the real mystery isn't what was lost but what was preserved, because somehow, despite catastrophic climate change, despite possible impacts, despite mass extinctions and flooding, and over 1,000 years of renewed Ice Age conditions, humans not only survived but came back stronger. Within 2,000 years of the Younger Dryas ending, we had built Göbekli Tepe. Within 6,000 years, we had developed agriculture, metallurgy, writing, and complex states. We went from scattered hunter-gatherer bands to urban civilizations faster than any other species in Earth's history. That kind of rapid development doesn't happen by accident. It happens when you already have the knowledge, the social structures, the cultural memory of how to build complex societies. You just need the conditions to become favourable again. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What else might we have forgotten? What other catastrophes might have erased chapters of our history? And most importantly, could it happen again? Picture this. It's 750 CE, and you're standing in the central plaza of Tikal, one of the greatest cities ever built in the Americas. Around you rise limestone pyramids that tower 20 stories into the tropical sky. Temples covered in brilliant red paint and intricate carvings dedicated to gods and kings. The plaza is packed with thousands of people. Nobles in jaguar pelts and quetzal feathers, merchants trading cacao and jade, farmers bringing tribute from the surrounding countryside, priests conducting rituals that have been performed for centuries. The city stretches for miles in every direction. Stone causeways connect massive temple complexes. Reservoirs capture precious rainwater. Ball courts host sacred games where the fate of kingdoms might be decided. Palaces house royal families whose bloodlines trace back hundreds of years. The walls are covered with hieroglyphic texts recording everything from astronomical observations to military victories to the genealogies of divine rulers. This isn't some primitive village. This is a sophisticated civilization. The Maya had developed advanced mathematics, including the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. They had created one of the most accurate calendar systems in human history. They could predict solar eclipses decades in advance. They had writing, art, architecture that rivals anything being built in Europe at the same time. Some Maya cities had populations exceeding 100,000 people. Population densities higher than most European cities of the era. Now fast forward 150 years, it's 900 CE, you're standing in the same plaza. But everything has changed. The temples are silent. The palaces are empty. Vegetation is already beginning to reclaim the stone causeways. The reservoirs are clogged with debris. The ball courts haven't seen players in decades. The whole city, this magnificent metropolis that had thrived for over 1,000 years, has been abandoned. Not damaged by war, not destroyed by invasion, just empty. And it's not just Tikal. Across the Maya heartland, one great city after another fell silent. Copan, Palenque, Calakmul, Caracol. Cities that had been centres of power for centuries simply stopped. The last dated monument at Tikal was carved in 869 CE. After that, nothing. At Copan, the last inscription is from 822 CE. One by one, like lights going out across a landscape, the great cities of the classical Maya civilization went dark. Within a single century, maybe 90% of the Maya population in the southern lowlands vanished. We're talking about millions of people gone. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic event, but in a cascading collapse that unfolded over several generations. And here's what makes this so haunting. They had time to leave messages. Unlike many lost civilizations the Maya could write. And some of their final inscriptions suggest they knew something terrible was happening. They just couldn't stop it. The last monuments show increasing preoccupation with warfare. More battle scenes, more captive sacrifices, more desperate appeals to the gods. Some inscriptions mention droughts, failed crops, starving populations. There are references to dynasties ending, to divine kings losing their mandate from heaven. The hieroglyphs become less elaborate, more rushed. Some monuments were left unfinished, suggesting the workers simply abandoned their tools and walked away. But here's where the mystery deepens. The Maya didn't disappear. The civilization collapsed, but the people survived. When the Spanish arrived 600 years later, they found millions of Maya living in smaller communities throughout the Yucatan and Guatemala highlands, speaking the same languages, practicing versions of the same religion, remembering fragments of the ancient glory days. What happened wasn't extinction, it was something stranger. The greatest civilization in pre-Columbian Americas simply chose, or was forced, to walk away from everything their ancestors had built. For decades, archaeologists argued about what caused the collapse. Some pointed to warfare. The late classical period shows evidence of increasing conflict between city-states, competition for resources, disputed territories, revenge cycles that could span generations. Some cities show signs of violent destruction in their final years. Burned palaces, defaced monuments, scattered skeletal remains suggesting massacres. But warfare alone doesn't explain it. The Maya had been fighting wars for centuries. Conflict was built into the political structure of their civilization. Cities rose and fell, dynasties came and went, but the overall system kept functioning. Until suddenly it didn't. Others blamed environmental collapse. The Maya heartland was tropical rainforest, which seems lush and fertile but actually has very poor soil. All the nutrients are locked up in the vegetation itself. Clear the forest for agriculture, and you get maybe a few years of decent crops before the soil is exhausted. The Maya had developed sophisticated techniques to deal with this. Terracing, raised fields, forest gardens that mimicked natural ecosystems. But these systems required constant maintenance and deep ecological knowledge. As populations grew, the pressure on the land increased. More forest had to be cleared. More marginal lands had to be cultivated. The system became increasingly fragile. Any disruption, any sustained crisis could trigger cascading failures, and the paleoclimate data shows exactly such a crisis occurred. Analysis of lake sediments, cave formations, and tree rings reveals a devastating pattern. Starting around 800 CE, the Maya heartland experienced a series of severe droughts, not occasional dry years, which the Maya were used to, but decades-long mega droughts. The worst dry periods in the region in thousands of years. Rainfall may have dropped by 40% or more during the peak drought periods. For a civilization dependent on seasonal rains to fill their reservoirs and water their crops, this was catastrophic. The elaborate water management systems that had made the great cities possible began to fail. Reservoirs dried up, crops withered, food stores were depleted, and the Maya political system, based on the divine authority of kings who claimed to control the rains and guarantee prosperity, began to crumble. Imagine being a Maya farmer watching your children go hungry while the priest conducted ever more elaborate rituals to bring the rains. Year after year, sacrifices, ceremonies, appeals to the gods, And year after year, the dry season lasting longer, the wet season bringing less rain. At some point you start to question, maybe the kings aren't divine. Maybe the gods have abandoned us. Maybe this whole system that we've built our lives around is broken. The inscriptions suggest exactly this kind of crisis of faith. References to failed rituals, to divine kings losing their connection to the supernatural realm. Some texts seem almost desperate, promising the gods ever greater sacrifices if they'll just send rain. But the rains didn't come, or came too little, too late. But it wasn't just drought. The Maya had created a perfect storm of interconnected vulnerabilities. Deforestation had made the region more prone to soil erosion and local climate change. Intensive agriculture had depleted soil nutrients. The complex trade networks that moved goods between ecological zones became disrupted as individual cities began to fail. The warfare increased as desperate populations competed for dwindling resources. And the political structure, based on elaborate displays of wealth and power, became unsustainable. Maya kings weren't just political leaders. They were supposed to be living gods, intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Maintaining this illusion required constant construction projects, elaborate ceremonies, displays of luxury goods. As resources became scarce, the gap between the elite and commoners widened. The ruling class demanded more tribute from people who had less and less to give. Eventually, something had to break. And what broke was trust. Trust that the kings could control the cosmos. Trust that the system would provide. Trust that sacrificing to the gods would bring prosperity. Once that trust eroded, the whole elaborate structure of Maya civilization had nothing to hold it up. People simply stopped participating. They stopped bringing tribute, stopped showing up for construction projects, stopped acknowledging the divine authority of rulers who couldn't even make it rain. Some probably tried to hold on. The unfinished monuments suggest last-ditch efforts to restore the old ways. But you can't command rainfall through sheer will. You can't resurrect a failing agricultural system through royal decree. The cities, designed for populations of tens of thousands supported by intensive agriculture across vast territories, became death traps. Better to leave, disperse into smaller communities, return to more sustainable ways of living that didn't depend on massive infrastructure and divine kings. And that's what they did. Over several generations, the great cities were abandoned, not all at once in panicked flight, but gradually, family by family, as people made the rational decision that their chances of survival were better elsewhere. Some went north to the Yucatan, where cenotes, natural sinkholes that provided access to groundwater, made communities less vulnerable to drought. Others retreated into the highlands. Still others dispersed into small farming communities throughout the forest. The Maya themselves survived. Their languages, cultures, and traditions continued. But the classical civilization, with its great cities and divine kings and monumental architecture, that was finished. The jungle reclaimed the temples. Roots broke apart the plazas. Within a few generations, the greatest cities in the Americas were being swallowed by vegetation, becoming mysterious ruins that later Maya would regard with awe and incomprehension. Here's what haunts archaeologists. The Maya collapse wasn't inevitable. These weren't primitive people overwhelmed by forces beyond their understanding. They were sophisticated, intelligent, capable of amazing achievements. They understood astronomy, mathematics, engineering. They had hundreds of years to see the problems developing. Deforestation, soil depletion, population pressure, political dysfunction. It was all visible, documented in their own records. But they couldn't change course. The system they'd built, the beliefs they held, the political structures they depended on, all of it had become so rigid, so invested in specific ways of doing things, that adaptation became impossible. Even as the crisis deepened, they kept building bigger temples, conducting more elaborate rituals, fighting more wars, doing more of what had worked in the past, even though it clearly wasn't working anymore. Sound familiar? We live in a world facing environmental challenges the Maya never imagined. Climate change, resource depletion, biodiversity collapse. We have far more knowledge, far better technology than they ever did. But we also have systems, economic and political structures that resist change even when we can see disaster approaching. The Maya couldn't save their civilization. The question that keeps archaeologists awake at night is simple: can we? Picture a room the size of a city block. Stone shelves from floor to ceiling. Scrolls stacked so densely that the air itself smells like ink, papyrus, and old dust. Scholars moving quietly through the aisles, candles flickering, voices kept low so as not to disturb the fragile treasures around them. This was the kind of place the ancient world built when it decided knowledge itself was worth worshipping. And again we burned it down. When people talk about lost knowledge, one name always floats up through the smoke: Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building filled with scrolls, it was an entire system, a machine for capturing information from the whole known world and locking it into one place. Ships that entered the city's harbour were supposedly searched for scrolls. Anything written was taken, copied, and added to the collection. The original might even be kept, with the copy returned. A quiet form of intellectual piracy in the name of preservation. We don't know exactly how big the library was. Ancient writers throw around numbers like 400,000 scrolls, 700,000. It almost doesn't matter. What matters is what it tried to be. A complete memory of the Mediterranean world. Inside those shelves were works we know only by name, entire philosophical schools that have vanished, scientific treatises on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, engineering, plays that were never performed again, histories of conquered people, written from their own perspective, not from that of their conquerors. Imagine walking through those aisles. You pull out a scroll on early mechanical devices, automata that moved with water pressure and steam, another on lost star catalogues that mapped constellations we no longer name, another that carefully recorded oral traditions from cultures that left almost no physical trace behind. Now imagine that same room a few centuries later, the shelves half empty, some scrolls already brittle and crumbling because no one has copied them in generations, parts of the campus repurposed, a wing used as storage, a quiet, almost imperceptible decline as funding, interest and stability dry up. The fall of Alexandria wasn't one dramatic bonfire with a villain swinging a torch. It was a process. Multiple wars, shifting empires, religious conflicts, neglect, each event taking a little more. A storeroom burned here, a collection looted there, a generation of scholars scattered or killed, leaving no apprentices to continue their work. By the time the library truly died, most of what it held had already slipped into oblivion, and that's the part that's hardest to grasp. We can list some of the authors we lost, men like Hypatia, whose work survives mostly in fragments and hostile accounts written by those who hated her, or the many playwrights of classical Greece whose plays were never copied because a monk in a later century simply preferred different texts. But for every name we can still pronounce, there were thousands we never knew existed. Entire schools of mathematics might have vanished there. Alternative medical traditions, early experiments in steam power, philosophies that suggested different ways of organizing society, family, law. When Alexandria finally went dark, it was as if someone had taken a blade to the nervous system of ancient knowledge and cut through multiple nerves at once. and Alexandria wasn't unique. It's just the most famous scar. Across the ocean, and centuries later, another kind of library burned. This time, the shelves weren't stone, they were folded bark. Painted glyphs on long accordion-like pages, Maya codices. Maya scribes recorded their world with meticulous care. Not on fragile papyrus, but on specially treated fig tree bark, coated with a thin layer of lime to make a writing surface. On these pages they wrote about astronomy, cycles of time, planting seasons, myths, dynastic histories, rituals, mathematics. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they did not see libraries, they saw demons. Mayan glyphs were called devil's work. And so, in plazas and courtyards, across Mesoamerica, conquistadors and missionaries piled codices into heaps and set them on fire. One bishop, Diego de Landa, proudly recorded that he had burned a great number of books because they contained nothing but superstitions and lies of the devil. To him, it was an act of purification. To history, it was an amputation. Today, we have precisely 4 Maya codices that survived those fires. 4. Maybe a handful more fragments hiding in private collections or mislabeled in obscure archives. But as far as we know, almost the entire written memory of a civilization was turned to ash within a single human lifetime. Think about that. Imagine if all of ancient Greek literature were reduced to 4 surviving books. No Homer, no Plato, no Euclid, just 4 random survivors. What did we lose in those Mayan books? We know they tracked Venus and other planets with astonishing accuracy. We know they developed complex calendars and number systems. Some scholars suspect that lost codices might have contained detailed histories of droughts, famines, wars, clues that could help us understand their so-called collapse in ways we can barely grasp now. They might also have preserved local myths that never made it into oral traditions recorded later under colonial pressure, whole pantheons, hero stories, philosophies about life, death, and time spiralling in cycles instead of lines, gone in smoke. On the other side of the old world, another library rose, flourished, and then fell into silence, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. In the early centuries of the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad became a kind of Alexandria reborn. Scholars from across the Abbasid Caliphate gathered there. They translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and earlier Arabic works into a single shared language. They didn't just preserve those texts, they critiqued them, expanded them, corrected them. Astronomy, algebra, optics, medicine, philosophy, mechanics. The House of Wisdom and the scholars around it didn't see knowledge as something to fence off, but as something to weave together. They took Indian numerals and positional notation and refined them into what we now call Arabic numerals. They combined Greek geometry with Babylonian observational astronomy and produced more accurate planetary models. They analysed and translated texts that would later return to Europe and ignite the Renaissance. And then, in 1258, the Mongols arrived. Accounts from the time describe the Tigris River running black with ink and red with blood. The story that manuscripts were thrown into the river until they formed makeshift bridges might be apocryphal, but it captures a deeper truth. An entire intellectual ecosystem was shattered. We don't know exactly which texts vanished in that siege. Some had been copied elsewhere, others survived in private collections. But many works by early Islamic scientists, philosophers and historians were never seen again. The commentaries that would have helped later readers navigate ancient Greek texts, the experimental data that underpinned theoretical claims, the marginal notes where scholars argued with one another across generations, all gone in a matter of days. Baghdad did not fall into complete darkness, and neither did the wider Islamic world. But the beating heart of that cosmopolitan, multilingual, cross-cultural research machine stopped, and with it, The chain of transmission for countless ideas snapped. The truth is, every civilization has its own lost library stories. In China, dynastic cycles of conquest and rebellion saw archives burned, rewritten, purged. In Europe, monasteries that had patiently copied texts for centuries were torched in war, dissolved for political reasons, or simply neglected until their manuscripts rotted in damp rooms. In West Africa, cities like Timbuktu accumulated vast collections of manuscripts on astronomy, law, poetry, medicine, many of which still sit, fragile and half-decayed, in private chests, their edges eaten by insects, their ink fading. And then there are the quieter losses, the scroll that fell from a shelf and was never picked up, the codex that mould consumed while its owner fled a war, the book no scribe thought worth copying, because current fashions had shifted and its ideas sounded old-fashioned, or heretical, or just boring. We like to imagine knowledge as something that accumulates steadily, a rising staircase from ignorance to understanding, but history shows us something different. Knowledge grows in fits and starts, and every so often someone swings a hammer and knocks out entire steps. When a library burns or an archive crumbles, we don't just lose facts, we lose questions. The questions those texts were asking, the frameworks they used, the assumptions they challenged. The alternative ways of seeing the world that might have led down paths we never took. Maybe an Alexandrian engineer had already sketched out a primitive steam engine, then dismissed it as a curiosity. Maybe a Mayan astronomer had found a subtle irregularity in planetary motion that could have sparked new physics centuries earlier. Maybe a scholar in Baghdad had noticed patterns in disease that pointed toward germ theory, long before microscopes existed. Or maybe what we lost wasn't technological at all. Maybe it was different models of society, systems of law that balance power in ways we haven't tried, philosophies that viewed the natural world not as something to conquer, but as a web of reciprocity, educational methods that taught memory, logic, and creativity with techniques we can only guess at. Those ideas might have been written down once, carefully, lovingly, in ink on a surface that now exists only as dust embedded in the soil beneath our feet. When you look back across these destroyed libraries, Alexandria, the Maya codices, the House of Wisdom, the vanished monastic collections, the damp archives of forgotten cities, you begin to see human history not as a smooth line, but as a series of bright flares separated by long stretches of darkness. Light, then ash, then a new light, built not from everything that came before, but from whatever scraps happened to survive. Those gaps are not just blank spaces on timelines. They shape who we are. They decide which philosophies become dominant, which technologies seem natural, which narratives become the story of humanity, and which are erased so completely we don't even know they once existed. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine those lost shelves, the scroll in Alexandria that could have changed our understanding of the cosmos, the Mayan book that laid out a centuries-long record of climate cycles, the Baghdadi manuscript that hinted at laws of motion or probability, or biology in language we would instantly recognize today, if only we could read it. Somewhere, in the invisible library of everything that once was written, those texts still exist. We will probably never see them, but the gaps they left behind are part of why our history feels so strange, so full of sudden leaps and inexplicable silences, so full of firsts that might in truth be rediscoveries. The world we live in is built not just on what survived, but on everything that didn't. Close your eyes for a moment and rewind the world. Not 100 years, not 1,000. Go back 20,000 years. The last ice age is still gripping the planet. Massive ice sheets, miles thick, are locked over North America, over northern Europe, over parts of Asia. So much water is frozen on land that the shape of the continents is completely different. The world you know, the blue planet on the classroom poster, the familiar outline of the continents, doesn't exist yet. Sea level is lower, not a few feet, not the height of a house, but almost 400 feet lower than today. That number is easy to skip over, so let it sink in. 400 feet, the height of a 40-story building. Whole shelves of continental coastline that are underwater today were dry land then. Wide plains where now there is only open sea. River valleys, lakes, marshes and beaches stretching far beyond the modern shore. If you could drain the oceans back down to their ice age levels, the planet would look shockingly wrong to you. Britain would not be an island. It would be the highlands of a much larger peninsula, attached to Europe by a broad green plain. Japan would be welded to the Asian mainland by wide stretches of land. Southeast Asia would look less like a scattered spray of islands and more like a single sprawling subcontinent. The Persian Gulf, mostly a low, fertile basin with rivers winding through it, not a body of water at all, and almost all of the coastal cities and ports you know today, New York, London, Shanghai, Mumbai, would sit far inland, their current locations just empty beaches at the edge of a narrower sea. For tens of thousands of years humans lived in that other world, hunted along those drowned riverbanks, gathered shellfish on those vanished coasts, built camps, followed game trails, watched the stars rise over horizons that today are hidden far beneath the waves. Then, very slowly at first, the world began to melt. The ice sheets retreated, glaciers shrank. Year after year, century after century, the oceans rose. Not in a single apocalyptic surge, but in long pulses. Meltwater poured off the ice sheets in catastrophic bursts. Coastlines crept inland, then sometimes leapt. Over roughly 10,000 years, sea level climbed those 400 feet. Imagine living in a small fishing camp on a low-lying plain, watching the shoreline inch closer with each generation. Elders pointing to the distant waves and saying, "When I was a child, the water was far out there." Stories of forests that used to stand where now the tides roll in. At human timescales, it felt both glacial and terrifyingly real. People who wanted to stay near the sea, for fish, for shellfish, for trade, just kept moving, step by step, following the shrinking edge of the land. And as they retreated, everything they left behind was quietly, steadily erased. Now, most of the richest, most stable environments on Earth for early humans were those coastal margins, where rivers met the sea, where tides mixed nutrients, where fish and birds and plants were abundant year-round. If you were going to build anything permanent, if you were going to create villages, experiments in agriculture, early harbours, that's where you do it. Which means something simple and unsettling. If early complex societies ever arose long before the civilizations we know, if they clustered along those ancient coasts, most of their traces would now be hundreds of feet underwater. We're missing a coastline the size of a lost continent, and every now and then the ocean allows us a glimpse of what might still be down there. Take Doggerland. Today, when you look at a map, you see the North Sea separating Britain from continental Europe. Grey water, busy shipping lanes, wind farms standing in the waves. But under that water, hidden beneath layers of mud and sand, lies the ghost of another landscape. In the early 20th century, fishermen dragging their nets through the North Sea began pulling up strange things. Ancient animal bones, antlers, even worked flint tools. Not from shipwrecks, from the seafloor itself. As scientists studied these finds, a picture emerged. During the last ice age and for thousands of years afterward, the North Sea wasn't a sea at all. It was a low, broad plain, marshland, rivers, lakes, connecting Britain to Europe. Archaeologists now call it Doggerland. It would have been a paradise for hunter-gatherers. rich with game, migratory birds in their thousands, rivers full of fish, gentle hills, sheltered valleys, a perfect place to live. And people did live there for millennia. We know from the tools and the animal bones that humans hunted and camped and likely settled on that drowned land. Some reconstructions show a patchwork of small communities moving with the seasons, perhaps even trading along the riverways. Then, between about 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, the sea rose high enough to flood the lowest parts of Doggerland. Eventually, a catastrophic event, perhaps a massive undersea landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, sent enormous waves across the plain. Low-lying areas vanished quickly. The rest was slowly gnawed away by the rising North Sea. By 6,000 years ago, what had once been fertile countryside was open ocean. Today, those people's homes, their hearths, their paths, their burial grounds lie under tens of meters of cold, grey water. We only know they were there because bits and pieces get snagged in modern fishing gear or appear in sonar surveys for pipelines and wind farms. Now shift your attention halfway around the world to the coast of India. Off the shores of Gujarat lies a modern city, Dwarka. But not far off that coast, under the Arabian Sea, sonar surveys in the early 2000s revealed something unexpected. A series of geometric features on the seafloor, long straight lines, right angles, patterns that didn't look like random geology. Divers and remote cameras found large blocks of stone, arranged in patterns that might be walls, platforms, foundations. Pottery fragments on the seabed were dated to several thousand years old, around the time of the early Indus Valley civilization. Some researchers argue these are the submerged remains of an ancient port city. Others are more cautious, pointing out that natural rock formations can sometimes masquerade as architecture, and that artifacts can migrate across the sea floor. But the idea took root, in part because myths had already placed an ancient city there. In Hindu tradition, Dwarka is described as a city of Krishna, built near the sea, later swallowed by the ocean, a place of exquisite beauty and great age, lost to rising waters, myth and sonar, legend and archaeology. Each on its own is uncertain. Together they invite that quiet, lingering question: how many stories of cities claimed by the sea might be more than just metaphors? And Dwarka and Doggerland are not alone. In the Black Sea, beneath dark, almost oxygen-free waters, researchers have found drowned shorelines, ancient beaches, and structures that might be human-made, hinting at villages flooded thousands of years ago. Off the coast of Japan, at a site called Yonaguni, divers discovered stepped terraces and flat platforms carved into the bedrock. Some geologists see only natural erosion, others see possible human modification, a monument or temple complex submerged as sea levels rose. Along the Caribbean and Mediterranean coasts, sonar surveys keep revealing ancient harbours, quays and breakwaters from classical times, clear evidence that even in relatively recent history, shorelines were not where they are today. These are only the shallowest, easiest to reach hints, brief glimpses at the very top edge of a world 400 feet deep. If you look at a population map of early civilizations you've already heard of, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the early Chinese dynasties, you notice a pattern. They all hug rivers and deltas, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. But remember, those are just the survivors, the ones that happened to rise after the seas stabilized, after about 6,000 years ago, when shorelines stopped marching inland so dramatically. Before that, throughout all the long millennia when sea level was still rising, where would people have gathered? Where they always did, on the coasts, on river mouths, in estuaries, on low-lying plains that now are silent sea floor. It doesn't require any lost super civilization to fill in the picture. Just ordinary humans like you and me doing the most logical thing, building near the water, villages that persisted for centuries, ports that were used for trade in stone blades or shells or early crops, maybe even experimental towns where people first tried out more intensive farming, or the earliest versions of boats sturdy enough for long coastal voyages. When we look back from our era, we see a strange pattern, a sudden appearance of complex societies about 6,000 years ago, almost out of nowhere. Maybe that nowhere is just underwater. Our myths seem to remember. Flood stories echo in culture after culture, scattered across the globe. They're not all the same, but their outlines rhyme. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, warned by a god of an oncoming flood, told to build a great boat to save his family and the animals. The waters rise, the world is drowned, and when they recede, life begins again on higher ground. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah's story repeats the pattern. Warning, ark, animals, deluge, a dove searching for dry land. In India, there's the story of Manu, warned by a fish about a coming flood. He builds a boat, ties it to the horn of the fish, and is guided through the waters until they subside. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a great flood sent by Zeus, drifting in a chest until they land on a mountain peak. On the other side of the world, many indigenous traditions in the Americas tell of great waters that rose and covered the land, of people fleeing to mountain tops or floating on logs and rafts. In Australia, some Aboriginal groups preserve songlines, oral maps, that describe shorelines and islands that today are underwater, yet match what geologists reconstruct for the coast thousands of years ago when sea level was lower. You can explain any one of these myths as symbolism, as local river floods, exaggerated over time as universal human themes of destruction and renewal. But taken together, across so many cultures, over so many thousands of years, in a world where the oceans really did rise 400 feet, they start to sound less like pure invention and more like inherited memories. Memories of people who watched the sea coming in, who saw familiar paths vanish, who lost hunting grounds, orchards, sacred sites, entire landscapes to the creeping tide, who told their children and their children's children, once you could walk out where now the waves are. Now, imagine how much detail those stories have lost. Names of actual villages, specific harbours, places that existed for centuries, perhaps millennia, and then were turned into nothing but water and silt. How many experiments in social life, how many ways of building, of trading, of remembering the stars, all erased simply because they were in the wrong place when the world warmed. Our archaeology is biased toward what's convenient. Dry land, shallow soil, visible ruins. But an enormous portion of early human history likely played out along coasts now drowned, on lands as invisible to us as if they were on another planet. We are like investigators who can only search the attic of a house, while most of the evidence lies in a flooded basement. That basement, though, is finally beginning to give up its secrets. Modern technology is our snorkel, our flashlight, our first tentative steps down the stairs. Multi-beam sonar can sweep over the seafloor and create detailed 3D maps, revealing ancient river channels, sandbanks, even the ghostly lines of possible roads or walls. Sub-bottom profilers send sound waves down through the mud, recording the echoes that bounce back from buried layers. Hidden shorelines, old lake beds, and sediment changes tell the story of the landscapes that no longer exist on the surface. Underwater LiDAR mounted on slow-moving survey vessels or on autonomous underwater vehicles can capture incredibly precise images of shallow coastal sites, turning murky water into clear digital models. remote-operated vehicles with cameras and robotic arms can reach depths that human divers cannot, picking up artifacts and filming stone structures resting in perpetual twilight. As offshore wind farms and undersea cables expand, more and more of the continental shelf is being surveyed with these tools, not for archaeology, but for engineering. And each survey is a potential accidental discovery, another Doggerland, another drowned valley, another forgotten settlement. We're at the very beginning of this exploration. What we've found so far, submerged Mesolithic campsites, ancient harbours, traces of old shorelines with worked tools, is like skimming the first few pages of a lost book and realising the rest of the chapters are still sealed shut. How many stories about our species are still down there? We don't know how many times humans tried to build something complex before the civilizations we now study in textbooks. We don't know how many regional cultures flourished and faded within those narrow, fertile bands that now lie beneath the sea. What we do know is that the ocean is not just a blue emptiness on the map, it's an archive. 400 vertical feet of forgotten coastlines, a library of landscapes where our ancestors walked, loved, feared, traded, told stories, and watched the water rise. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can picture them. Small fires burning on a shoreline that doesn't exist anymore. Voices speaking languages no one has heard for 10,000 years. Children playing near the tide line. Elders pointing to the horizon and saying, "Out there, under the waves, that was once our land." Their world is gone, but maybe not forever. Sonar ping by sonar ping, scan by scan, we're beginning to read the drowned chapters of our own story, and each new discovery beneath the waves whispers the same quiet reminder. What we think of as the beginning may only be what's still above water. The pattern keeps repeating, across hundreds of thousands of years, across continents, across species. Small groups rise, learn, adapt, and build. Then something shifts. Climate changes, rivers move, trade routes crumble, empires overreach, and what once seemed permanent dissolves. From the bottlenecked survivors clinging to life 900,000 years ago, to the farmers of the Indus Valley quietly walking away from their cities, to the Maya kings watching their pyramids outlast their power, human history is a long series of appearances and disappearances. What survives is never the whole story. It's whatever happened to be durable enough, lucky enough, or buried deep enough to escape decay. Everything else is gone. Think of what actually makes it into the archaeological record. Stone, bone, fired clay, metal if it doesn't rust away first, hard things, heavy things, the things that don't rot when exposed to air and water and soil. But most of what humans have ever made, used, or loved was soft. Wooden houses, textile clothing, leather shoes, reed baskets, paper scrolls, painted banners, carved wooden statues, musical instruments made of gut and skin and hollowed branches. Every story told by a fire and never written down. Every song that lived only in a grandmother's voice. Every map drawn on bark or hide. Every treaty scratched in ink on fragile parchment. They all had a half-life measured in years or decades, not millennia. By the time the first archaeologist even thinks to dig, they've turned back into soil. Even stone betrays us. In humid forests, vines pry it apart. In deserts, temperature swings crack it into dust. In earthquake zones, whole cities can be ground into unrecognizable rubble. And even when the stones remain, the meaning can vanish. A ring of upright rocks becomes a ritual site because we don't know what else to call it. A mound covered in grass becomes just a hill until someone cuts into it and finds a buried temple, or a palace, or a tomb. Now imagine how much has disappeared without a trace. Most coastlines from the last ice age are gone, drowned under rising seas. If there were fishing villages or trading ports, or even early cities along those ancient shores, they're now dozens of meters underwater, scattered, eroded, or buried deep in seafloor sediment. We see hints. A submerged wall here, a drowned road there. But we don't see the full picture. We see puzzle pieces with most of the pieces missing. And yet, in the middle of all that loss, new tools are giving us glimpses we never had before. Archaeology is no longer just a person with a trowel and a brush, kneeling in the dust. It's satellites scanning the desert for faint outlines of buried walls. It's LiDAR lasers fired from planes, slicing through jungle canopies to reveal entire lost cities hidden under the trees for 1,000 years. It's ground-penetrating radar that can map structures without moving a single stone. It's ancient DNA pulled from worn teeth and crumbly bones, patched together in sterile labs to reveal who lived where, who they were related to, who they loved, who they fought. We can read climate histories from ice cores and lake sediments, match them to the timelines of collapses and migrations, and suddenly the rise and fall of cities looks less like mystery and more like a conversation between humans and their environment. We can scan charred scrolls from burned libraries and virtually unroll them, rescuing words that fire tried to erase. We can reconstruct entire genomes of vanished peoples from a single bone fragment or a few grains of calculus stuck to ancient teeth. Every year the invisible becomes just a little more visible. Barrens hills become former citadels. Empty plains turn into maps of forgotten roads and fields and walls. What looked like absence reveals itself as presence waiting to be seen. And yet, even with all this technology, there are limits we may never cross. We will never hear the exact sound of a Neanderthal lullaby. We will never know the personal names of the thousands of artisans who built Indus Valley drains, or painted Mayan murals deep inside buried palaces. We will never read the majority of ancient books that were burned, or soaked, or eaten by insects. For every fragment we save, there are 1 million that vanished before we were born. This isn't just a scientific problem, it's a philosophical one. If most of our past has disappeared, what does that say about who we are? Are we defined by the thin layer of evidence that happened to survive, the stones, bones, and fired clay, or by the ocean of forgotten lives beneath that surface? Think about those long dark ages when writing faded or disappeared. The Greek world after the fall of the Mycenaean palaces, the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, the stretches of time in Africa, the Americas, Oceania, and beyond, where complex societies rose and fell without leaving written records we can read. On paper, these look like empty spaces, dark ages, prehistory, gaps. But to the people living in them, they weren't gaps at all. They were full of marriages and funerals, full of migrations and experiments and quiet revolutions, full of new myths to explain the sky, the seasons, the strange ruins already old in their own time. In those eras when written words failed, spoken words did the heavy lifting. Oral traditions became the libraries, elders became the archives, stories became the storage devices that carried knowledge across centuries. A tale about a trickster god stealing fire might preserve memories of the first controlled use of flame. A flood myth repeated around a cooking fire might contain distorted echoes of a real river that changed course or a coastline that vanished under rising seas. A long winding genealogy spoken at a ceremony might be the only surviving record of ancient alliances, migrations, and forgotten clans. The details shift, the characters morph, the timelines blur, but underneath, important information survives. Where the good water is, which plants heal and which plants kill. What happened the last time the rains failed, or the ice advanced, or the strangers came from over the mountains. Anthropologists studying living oral cultures have found astronomical knowledge encoded in myths, navigation instructions hidden in songs, careful land management practices taught through legends and taboos. It's very likely that during our own dark ages this was how humanity kept the pilot light of knowledge burning. But oral traditions have their own form of decay. Stories get shorter, characters merge, events separate by centuries are folded into a single mythic age. Over time, what was once practical advice becomes sacred tale, and then sometimes just entertainment. By the time we arrive with notebooks and recording devices, the original events that inspired the story may be thousands of years gone. We're left to guess how much is memory and how much is metaphor. So we live with uncertainty. We have to. We can reconstruct ancient climates, but not the exact thoughts that passed through one woman's mind as she watched her city burn. We can map the spread of genetic lineages, but not the jokes people told as they walk their migration routes. We can find broken statues in the jungle, but not the particular anxiety a young mason felt as he carved the eyes of a king, hoping not to anger the gods or his supervisor. Some parts of the past will always remain private to the people who lived them, moments known only to those who were there, now resting with them in unmarked graves or scattered as trace elements in the soil. And that brings us quietly to the present, to us, to you. We live in a time that feels, on the surface, impossible to forget. Billions of photos, trillions of messages, entire lives documented second by second. It feels permanent. But is it? Most of what defined our era is as fragile as papyrus was to the Egyptians. We've just traded reeds and ink for wires and code. Hard drives corrode, servers fail, formats become unreadable, websites vanish overnight, vast archives of human conversation dissolve when a company shuts down or a password is forgotten. If someone 10,000 years from now went looking for us, what would they actually find? Concrete foundations, rusted metal, plastic fragments in the sediments, a strange layer in the rock filled with chicken bones and industrial chemicals. They might find a few lucky artifacts sealed in landfills, or entombed in collapsed subway tunnels, or preserved in some disaster-proof archive that managed to survive future wars and earthquakes. But the delicate things, our emails, our social media posts, our personal videos, our digital art, our jokes, our arguments, our fears, might be as gone as the bedtime stories told 50,000 years ago in a cave we'll never find. Future archaeologists might stand in the ruins of our cities and debate what we believed, how we lived, why we built what we did, why it ended. They might misread us the way we misread the past. They might imagine meanings for our monuments that never crossed our minds. They might attribute intention where there was only accident, or chaos where there was actually careful planning. Some of what we consider central, our politics, our current borders, our latest trends, may not show up at all. Gone, like smoke. It can be a sobering thought, but it can also be strangely comforting. The pattern that runs through everything we've explored tonight doesn't just belong to ancient people, it belongs to us too. We're another chapter in the same long story: rise, adaptation, crisis, recovery, forgetting, rediscovery. Like them, we are building things we hope will last. Like them, we are leaving traces we don't fully understand ourselves. Like them, we can't control what the future will remember. What we can do is pay attention. We can read the stones and the stories left to us, accept the gaps not as failures, but as invitations, reminders that the world has always been richer, stranger, and more complicated than the surviving records suggest. We can honour the unknown ancestors whose names we'll never learn, whose faces we'll never see, but whose choices, failures, and triumphs shaped the world we inherited. and we can live with the knowledge that someday someone else may sift through the echoes of our age, puzzling over what we left behind, filling in the blanks with their own imagination, just as we do now. In that sense, the mystery never really ends. It just changes hands. So now, at the end of this long journey through missing years and broken timelines, you can look back over everything we've wandered through together. Those first fragile generations, anatomically modern but living in a world with no cities, no writing, no monuments. The Bronze Age palaces going dark almost overnight, as if someone blew out a candle over half the known world. The Greek Dark Ages, when the people who would one day invent philosophy and drama and democracy moved through centuries that left almost no trace. The Indus Valley, with its perfect grids and quiet, undeciphered script, folding itself away so gently that we still don't know whether it truly fell or simply walked off stage. The Younger Dryas, with its hints of firestorms and sudden cold, and the possibility that whole chapters of early civilization were erased before they ever had a chance to be remembered. The Maya cities swallowed by jungle, their plazas and pyramids slowly taken back by roots and vines, while the people themselves adapted and endured in new ways. The libraries burned, the scrolls shattered, the tablets broken and scattered by war, accident, neglect, and time. The coastlines drowned after the last ice age, miles of once dry land now lying silent beneath the waves, holding stories we can only guess at. Threaded through all of this is one simple, astonishing truth: we're still here. Again and again, history stutters, collapses, vanishes into gaps and silences, and yet somehow there are always survivors. People who carry the songs, the skills, the memories, people who rebuild with whatever they have left. When you close your eyes and think about these lost ages, you're not just looking back at strangers, you're looking back at your own extended family, at minds that puzzled over the sky, that worried about children, that mourned their dead, that laughed around fires in languages we'll never hear again. Their worlds ended. Over and over, their stories didn't. They live on in the tilted stones, in the mysterious symbols, in the faint traces of pollen and charcoal and DNA. And they live on in you, in the curiosity that brought you here tonight, listening in the dark, following these broken paths through time. The gaps in our history aren't just empty spaces, they're invitations, places where your imagination is allowed to wander, to ask, what if, and who were they, and what did they know that we've forgotten? Science will keep chipping away at the unknowns, new digs will uncover new evidence, new methods will tease signals out of bones and sediments and deep sea cores. Some mysteries will shrink, others will deepen. That's part of the beauty. You don't have to be an archaeologist or a historian to be part of that process. Just staying curious matters, asking questions matters, refusing to accept simple answers when the truth is complicated and half buried. That matters too. If this journey through the lost ages helped you relax, or gave you something gentle to think about as you drift off, you can let me know in the simplest ways. If you'd like, you can tap the like button, or leave a comment telling me which part of our hidden history stayed with you the most. You can even share where you're listening from, what city, what country, what quiet room the past is keeping you company in tonight. And if you'd like to come back for more stories like this, more slow walks through deep time and forgotten worlds, you can subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. There's also an optional membership here on YouTube if you want to support the channel a little more directly. It's never expected but always appreciated. Just something you can choose if these videos have become a small, comforting part of your evenings. For now though, you don't need to do anything at all. You can just lie there, listening to your own breathing, feeling the weight of your body supported, knowing that you are part of a story that stretches back through ice ages and dark ages, collapses and rebirths, all the way to tiny groups of people who refused to give up when everything around them was falling apart. The mysteries are still out there. Cities beneath the jungle, harbours beneath the sea, words locked in scripts we can't yet read, memories waiting quietly in the dust. One day, someone, maybe not you, maybe not me, but someone, will uncover a little more. We'll brush away another layer and see something no human being has seen for thousands of years. And the story will grow just a bit clearer, even as new questions appear at the edges. As you drift towards sleep, you can let yourself rest in that thought, that you belong to a species that survives, that wonders, that tells stories across the darkness. You're part of an unbroken chain stretching through all the lost ages we've visited tonight and all the ones we haven't yet imagined. Let the questions soften for now. Let the ancient cities fade back into the mist. There will be time to explore again tomorrow. For tonight, you can simply float on the quiet, held by the deep, mysterious past that made you possible.